It's approximately 9 p.m. Kenyan time, and you're right in time for the exclusive and most comprehensive business bulletin in the country. A very good evening to you, and as always, we are glad that you chose to keep us company tonight. Hope you have heard some rest and the most deserved of them all on this Moi Day. I am Ndiro Ganga, ready to bring you up to speed with all the news making headlines across the globe. And as you know, we are all about business. Here's a glance of some of those stories creating waves in the business world.
It's important to support the action.
Climate change and development in Africa 7, all hands on deck in combating climate change.
To be very, very predictable.
Africa's largest economy in terms of GDP.
Pathway to Kenya Sustainability Global Consortium meeting calls for sustainable development persists.
Makes up nearly 40% of the gross domestic product.
We went, of course, to the Supreme Court following the announcement and were able to contest the results.
Third Africa Political Summit, Politics in Business.
We'll be hearing, I'm sure, from somebody.
Stakeholders in the environment sector from across the continent today gathered at the Safari Park Hotel in Nairobi for the official opening of Climate Change and Development in Africa 7 to discuss the realities of climate change and how to address them following the Paris Agreement that was adopted in 2015. The participants mainly focused on how to indulge the local communities in combating climate change on the continent. Our reporter Days Ombo attended the official opening of the conference and filed the following report.
Speaking on behalf of the President, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, the Cabinet Secretary from the Environment and Forestry Ministry, Keriako Tobiko, pointed out that the continent has shared ecosystems and that natural resources have no boundaries. It is essential that the relevant stakeholders continue to speak in one voice to safeguard the basis of development and seek transformative solutions.
That we have a unified voice when we go, as we proceed to COP24. We showcase our own solution. That have been developed, customized to fit our own African situation.
He said that local communities, the women and youth needed to be engaged in Africa's effort to combat the unpredictability of climate change because they also have the knowledge and solutions, and they are the most vulnerable members of our communities.
But even as we talk about local communities, it would be unfair to imagine that even within communities we have the most vulnerable groups within our communities. Climate change affects all of us, but it affects doubly, several times, tenfold, the most vulnerable members of our communities, the youth, who have had to suffer because of actions of their fathers, mothers, grandmothers, their parents. And they would have to live with the consequences long after their parents are gone.
In attendance was the Honorable Mohamed Almi, the Chief Administrative Secretary, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, who acknowledged that climate change was a reality and stated that we cannot afford to push aside the issue of climate change and asked people to join hands in an effort to curb it.
Climate change is a reality. It's no longer fake news. Somalis say, and I will now remove my hat, baldness and droughts creep on you. So those who have my hairstyle will know they don't see the hair falling. They slowly just see it empty. Droughts, the same thing happens. Climate change is doing the same to us. But we are lucky, the scientists have given us the facts. This particular one of climate change, we cannot afford to push it. If there is one thing we should become a global citizen on, it's climate change, because it's going to finish us. And particularly Africa. I listen to the scientists. They say Africa, because we're in the tropics, because of our low adaptive capacity, will be the most hit. And therefore, what is the message? We must pull up our socks. We must come together, break all barriers, government, organizations. Let's go back to our roots. Let's go back to our traditions. Let's work with our scientists.
While speaking to the press, Vihiga County Boss Governor Dr. Wilbur Otichilo pointed out the need for African governments to include a climate change program in the national budget, which is to be implemented even as the countries await the climate finance funds from developed nations.
We should be able to put climate change as one of the programs within our budget programs through our policy and legal frameworks, which are in terms of Kenya, we already have them. In that way, we are sure that we will be addressing the issues of climate change as we await for these finances that are promised.
The Secretary General of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, Mithika Mwenda, stated that the national governments have an important role in terms of addressing corruption for them to be able to access the funds for climate change action.
The obligation of the governments to address corruption within the framework which are established in that country. But we acknowledge the impact of corruption in the access of funds by the relevant communities, because the money, for instance, for adaptation is supposed to go to the people who are affected by climate change. So it's a concern even at global level, and what we want to see is how do we apply the framework which exists, because in every country there are mechanisms in addressing climate finance and how it should be utilized and go to the right place.
With climate change being a reality, it is upon the local communities, county and national governments and other relevant stakeholders to consolidate efforts in the march towards halting and hopefully reversing the adverse effects of climate change on the African continent. For BrandPlus TV Business News, I am Daisy Wambua.
For Africa to fully maximize on its potential and benefit economically, it needs to embrace sustainability in the field of agriculture and be guided by research. This was the clarion call at the Pathways to Sustainability Global Consortium meeting, whose theme was Understanding Sustainability Challenges and Key Research Needs, hosted by the Africa Sustainable Hub at the Kenya School of Monetary Studies. Take a look.
In a policy conversation.
Speaking at the event, the Principal Secretary, Agriculture and Research, Hamadi Idi Boga, said for food and nutritional security, which is one of the big four agenda by the President to be achieved, the country needs to embrace sustainable practices across industries and while at it think about long-term sustainable practices.
Our aspirations for food security and nutrition security cannot be looked in isolation if we are not discussing the issues of sustainability. And because it's not about food security and nutrition security for today and tomorrow. It's for the long haul.
Starting with the Agenda 2063.
However, for this to be possible, the PS went ahead to say that funds have to be set aside at both local and national level to go into research on long-term sustainable programs. This, he says, will then act as a blueprint for the agricultural sector moving forward.
We are also struggling with the systems of how to harness what comes out of research so that it can inform all our actions. So most of the time we do things on the fly without really referring to the evidence and the knowledge that already exists. So I think the lesson that can be learned from here is that The conversation between policymakers and researchers is very key, so that research is sustained and policy informs research and vice versa. Otherwise, we will be engaging in guesswork.
The agricultural productivity.
Dr. Richard Munang, United Nations Environment Africa Regional Climate Change Programming Coordinator, while addressing the conference, called for sustainable practices to save millions of dollars that go to waste in the agricultural sector.
How can we be able to utilize all of these to be able to drive transformational change, leveraging on what Africa have got in abundance? If you take as example these strategic sectors and how these strategic sectors can actually accelerate the realization of inclusive world. If you take Nigeria as an example, Africa's largest economy in terms of GDP, the agricultural sector makes up nearly 40% of the gross domestic product and generates livelihoods of about 70% of Nigerians. The sector is losing up to $9 billion each and every year as a result of post-harvest losses, primarily due to lack of adequate processing and value addition enterprises. If clean energy is decentralized to Nigeria's producers, these losses will be turned into productivity, specifically into $9 billion worth of income opportunities for farmers, for financiers amongst many, in addition to enhancing food security.
To be able to drive socio-economic.
Dr. Munang further said that Africa's potential needs to be unlocked, but this will only be through research and proper policy making and implementation. This will in turn open up opportunities such as employment to the African youth.
Researchers come up with to target specific bottlenecks towards maximizing the productivity of these catalytic sectors that I've mentioned. For instance, we can talk of enhancing the ease of mobilizing capital and doing business to maximize productivity of these catalytic sectors. But the bigger question that needs to be answered is how can research enable such a move? And that takes me to my third point. We are in a continent that the population is increasing, but this population is youthful. As we're speaking today, almost about 65% of the entire population is youthful. But at the same time, over 60% of this youthful population is unemployed. But all in all, this population represents Africa's sovereign capital, the people, and especially the over 200 million strong youthful population. Their skills, their talents, their energy, their entrepreneurial spirit represents the primary resource in driving the productivity of these catalytic sectors. Rather than premising financial resources sometimes as the most important, which has been the case in the continent today, it is very, very important for research to be able to show how can research enable such a paradigm shift where we can leverage on what the continent have also got in abundance. Financial resources are important, but they are a means to an end, not an end.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now,
from the conference, it is clear that for Africa to economically benefit from its wealth of resources, it must embrace sustainable practices and invest heavily in research. These are efforts that will not only translate in the short term, but upon which the posterity of the continent will be built upon.
Applying knowledge, not just generating it, but applying it.
On that sustainability note, let us head for a short commercial break, but do stay with us as we still have more news items on the other side. See you shortly. Welcome back to the most comprehensive, exclusively business news bulletin. Thank you for staying with us. And now turning to matters politics. Yes, you heard right, politics. Politics and business are strange bedfellows, but bedfellows nonetheless. In a large way, politics determines the economic environment in which businesses will operate in. It is for this reason that various stakeholders from across the continent convened for the third Africa Political Summit to deliberate on the event's theme, Building Strong Democracies in Africa. Our field team attended the forum, and here is the report.
To offer.
The event, which seeks to ensure that the continent builds democratic governments, saw the former Vice President, His Excellency Kalonzo Musyoka, give the keynote address, and in his opening remarks pointed out that democracy is the glue that holds good governance.
Let me therefore at the outset state that democracy is the glue to good governance. Without democratic mandate, regimes flounder as they force themselves on unwilling populace. The rule of the gun can never be a panacea to a restless people reeling under the stifling heat of autocracy. Needless to say, evidence abounds all over the world of regimes that have thrown democracy out of the window in favor of repression and dictatorship, but which have eventually been decimated by popular revolt.
The former vice president went on to point out that there have been mixed fortunes for the continent on the democratic front, with the wins and losses coming in equal measure.
Whereas certain African nations have enjoyed relative calm since independence, others have reeled under the painful yoke of coups and revolutions. I can tell you that at some stage the African Union had to actually pass a resolution outlawing military coup d'etats in Africa as undemocratic and therefore unacceptable.
In a moment of reflection, he looked back at the 2017 general election and the political action thereafter and how they impacted on the socio-economic environment.
We went, of course, to the Supreme Court following the announcement and were able to contest the results. The court granted our wish and now the presidential vote, which was a first, I think, for Africa, to have an announcement of a presidential outcome touching on a sitting head of state. And this was a first, I can assure you. And in fact, we give credit to President Uhuru Kenyatta because much as it really jolted his conscience, he was able to accept the outcome of that Supreme Court decision. However, the court, after granting our plea, ordered a rerun within 60 days. However, we as NASA boycotted the repeat poll because we felt the conditions were still not conducive to be able to deliver a free and fair election. Jubilee decided to go it alone, and then Kenya was literally on tenterhooks. There are threats even of secession. And then came the handshake between President Uhuru Kenyatta and Prime Minister Raila Odinga. This handshake, which was on March the 9th, diffused political tension in this country and calmed down the country, giving way to a return to a measure of normalcy and therefore conducive socio-economic environment. I believe as a result of the handshake, even our shilling strengthened.
He further pointed out his support for the handshake and his commitment to support the president in the fight against corruption, which is an economic cancer in the country.
I wholeheartedly support that handshake. And to give further impetus to that, only yesterday, I'm leader of my own political party, the Wiper Democratic Movement, and I went for a courtesy call to tell President Uhuru Kenyatta with my elected leaders that we now must move to the next level. And we therefore support you, Mr. President, when it comes to the fight against corruption. This is a big issue in this country, and I believe a big issue in Africa. If I'm not wrong, even at the heads of state level, the African Union has decided to make that the number one objective. But here President Kenyatta has literally taken the bull by its horns. And I keep on telling him, if you wink, Mr. President, then you lose a country.
Tom Wayne, an independent research consultant from the United States of America, who was also a speaker at the forum, pointed out that good governance must transcend the usual brand of politics for a prosperous Kenya.
Good governance is done by the right people and people who have been tested by organising well, by people who have been forced to build a coalition and to deliver for those people in an election. They will continue to do so because they will have this diverse group of people who are pressuring them to keep delivering, to keep being honest, to keep showing what they can do for the people of Kenya. And that is something that cannot be done just through politics as usual.
Politics and business, there cannot be one without the other. As the Third Africa Political Summit gets underway, we can only hope that a democratic Africa will be realized in our lifetime, and with it, the full economic potential of the continent will be realized. For BrandPlus TV Business News, I am Daisy Wambua.
The Ministry of Public Transport in the country is being urged to diversify the means of public transport in the country by introducing cycling to complement the current systems in place. This was said today at the Public Bicycle Sharing Regional Knowledge Exchange for Africa's Cities at Nairobi Safari Club. Take a look. Every morning, you either wake up early to get to work on time or find another excuse you haven't told your boss, since traffic will keep you long on the road. It is for this reason that the Public Bicycle Sharing Conference brought together relevant stakeholders to discuss the benefits of cycling to both the economy and the environment. However, the question is, for a populist used to cars, how do you sell cycling to them?
Actually, it's very easy to get people cycling. Research all around the world has shown that 60% of the people want to cycle, but they're afraid of cars. And there's only 1% of the people who are not afraid. They're the type of people who will jump out of an airplane with no worries. So these people will cycle anywhere. And you find that in all cities all over the world, there's 1% of the people who cycle. If you build some cycling infrastructure, you can convince people up to 7% to cycle. And if you build some really good infrastructure, like we have in the north of Belgium and in Holland, then you can go all the way up to 60% of the people to cycle.
For cycling to work in the continent, proper policies have to be put in place to enable it. According to Amanda Ngabirano, lecturer urban planning, Makerere University, top of that list is proper infrastructure and clear-cut traffic laws that will govern the cycling sector.
The government has to have a policy that actually backs its projects for the people, for cycling, for walking. So we need a policy about integrated transport or active mobility that will safeguard space for these people. The roads have to be shared. Roads have never been for only cars. Cars came into the system to save time, to make life faster, for privacy, but we shouldn't be enslaved in that. So the government has to have the policy in place. There has to be enforcement, because after the projects have been implemented, you will see still motorists going in the road space for the cyclists. So enforcement has to be very, very strong from the start. Then the African cities have to do the roads. They have to design them for people. When I look at Nairobi, you see they try to provide for a cyclist, for a pedestrian, but then they stop somewhere. It's like the cyclist should fly in some points, but for the car network, it's continuous. So they must have everybody in their minds when they're in the boardrooms, these planners and traffic engineers. So governments have to get the right people to do these things.
Further to this, Amanda says the economic implications of cycling are enormous if the sector is properly tapped into. For example, bike building and assembling plants is an industry worth billions of dollars worldwide.
Africa has to realize that cycling is business. We are going to employ so many people. The youth that are unemployed can be absorbed in the cycling industry, in the assembling plants of bicycles, in the accessories of bicycles, bicycle sharing stations. You see many people employed in Copenhagen. Cycling industry employs so many people in their country, and these are rich people. In Africa, we need jobs. So this would be like a win-win all the time. You get jobs, you get health, you get environment protected, and you get a more friendly city.
Equally, Ivan Faze adds that cycling opens up and promotes the low-level retail sector due to the ease of mobility and parking space.
There's some wonderful economic benefits. People who own shops, they think that people come by car. Reality is that most people don't go by car to a shop. There's only 13% of the people who go by car in Nairobi. But even worldwide, where there's a lot of cars available, if you try to find a parking space, you can almost never find one in front of a shop. But if you go by bicycle, you always have space in front of a shop. So if you look at how many customers, they did the research with the individual shop owners. They said, how many people do you think come by car? And they said, well, probably around 80%. Reality was that it was 10% coming by car, if you really ask the question. But this is Belgium, and about 40% came by bicycle, and another 40% came on foot or public transportation.
Cycling is a fairly new concept in the urbanized Africa. To this, the sector has a long way to go if it is to excel. For this reason, Amanda says it can borrow some lessons from successful cycling nations such as the Netherlands.
The biggest lesson that we can learn is to integrate our working approach. The people in those countries, the ministries work together at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level. We have no room for competition when we need good results. Because if you plan for a cycling network and then someone from the Ministry of, let's say, Trade comes up and complains, my business people are complaining, then that's already sabotage. But you don't see it in these countries. They coordinate and they sit together to have these projects work. The other thing that I have seen working is doing the real work, not talking. They actually go to meetings, they develop policies, and they implement them. Most African governments have policies that they don't implement. They have plans that they don't implement. If we could implement just a third of our plans, we would be having another face as Africa in terms of mobility, in terms of urban development. So 2 things. Integration of our work and also doing the real work.
When all is said and done, it is estimated that Nairobians spend up to 4 hours a day on traffic. This is the exact times that it takes one to fly from Johannesburg to Nairobi. This translates to time and resources loss. For this reason, it is high time various modes of transporting people, cycling included, are embraced to deal with the traffic jam menace and economic hemorrhage it causes once and for all. Now let's shift gears and take a look at how the markets performed today. And here is a summary. That is a run-through of how the markets performed, but for a more in-depth analysis of the same, tune in tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. for my next big bet with Brechonde Ritu and Karanje Daniel. Now let's see how the weather looks like, and here is the report. That is it from our business news desk tonight, but do make sure to tune in tomorrow at 9 p.m. for a fresh serving of news-making headlines in the business world. Do have a good night and try and enjoy what is left of your Moi Day.